This is going to be a little rough. Aggressiveness and even disdain and hatred has been the approach that I have taken towards spirituality and religion in the last couple of years, perhaps as a way to overcompensate for how aggressive and hateful I was while I was in the religious camp. Now I'm trying to make sure that I'm taking an honest and thoughtful approach. I hope that you approach this with an open mind and an open heart and don't come at it defensively right from the introduction. This is my religious post-mortem, as I've decided to call it. For as long as I can remember, I was a churchgoer. I went to the Sunday schools, the Sunday sermons, Wednesday youth groups, every event I could get into, discipleship groups, camps, Royal Rangers, Bible quizzes, everything that I could sink my teeth into, I attended, whether it was because I was told that I had to or because I really and desperately wanted to. I did everything I could, and later on, I participated even more and got more involved by doing things like leading some of those discipleship groups and Sunday schools. And a couple of times I was a leader in like a children's summer school of some kind. I think it was called Vacation Bible School, if I'm remembering that right, which if I am, that's a really impressive memory. Good job, me. But I was a leader in those activities, and I continued to be as involved as I possibly could in the church. That's the person I was. That's how involved I was. I wasn't just passively attending church. I was very active in church. It was pretty much my entire life. And I personally didn't realize exactly how involved I really was in church activities and how abnormal that was until I was working on this post and thinking back on that period of my life and realized just how church focused I was between the ages of about 12 to probably 18 or even 19. I want to be really careful about what I say here. I hope that it is clear from this that I think that there were both very positive and very negative results from the period of my life where I was hyper-religious. There were really good elements of it that helped make me a better person in the long run, even if there were parts of it that were making me a worse person that needed to be worked out and overcome. In particular, I remember I was a pretty angry and frustrated kid. There was a pastor at the church that I went to who I loved very much and still love, and he really helped me work through some of those things. We did counseling, I think once a week. I would go into his office and he would talk to me, and sometimes it was just us sitting there and chatting, and other times he was really helping me work through some of these things. I can tell you with certainty that that helped me considerably. So I'm not sitting here trying to tell you that everything about it was completely negative. There were definitely some positive aspects of it, and I believe that some of these positive things have carried through to me today and made me a better person, even if at the time the negative aspects were making me a nigh on unbearable individual. I grew up in a generation that for the first time could make their voice heard to the entire world. As a result of that, all of my angry, angsty, teenage religious opinions were being spewed across the entire internet. I figured out how to make a blog, and I filled that blog with some really horrible things that I absolutely disagree with today. Religion and anger for me when I was a teenager is kind of a chicken and the egg situation. I know that most teenagers are just generally angry. Most of my posts at the time that came off as very angry were religious at their center. Most of them, not all of them. So it's hard for me to say for sure if I was just an angry person who was using religion as a mask so that my anger seemed righteous, or if I was a really religious person who was posting things he believed were dedicated to his religion that were ultimately really angry as well. So some of this anger was definitely from religion, some of it was from being a teenager, and most of my posts were religious anger and me attempting to make my anger seem righteous. The Bible, particularly in the New Testament, repeatedly calls people to be kind and compassionate and loving, caring, empathetic, and I was absolutely none of these things for the majority of my religious life. During that period of my life, I was just angry and incredibly unforgiving. And to be completely honest with you, so were a lot of the people around me, even if they weren't as angry about it. Their approach to a lot of things that they viewed as being horrendously sinful and unforgivable was really angry and pretty disgusting. I was in that camp for sure. I refused to empathize. I really was not an empathetic person at all, just in general. Whether it was somebody I thought was a sinner or a friend or an acquaintance, whatever it was, I had no empathy. I believed it was my way or the highway. There was no way that your opinion could be right and my opinion could be correct. I noticed contradictions in the church when I was younger, and that also made me angry and made me angry at the church, which of course alienated the only people around me who are not my family members. Now, I never used this to look at my own behavior. I just saw problems in the church and the way that they weren't living out things in the Bible that I personally felt they should be living out. And so that made me angry, and I made a lot of posts about that, which caused controversy. I remember one in particular was when I wrote a post that essentially said that Christians should swear and that it is not sinful to swear or use any sort of language because it was the intent behind it rather than the word itself. It was things like that that I saw within the church. It was something that I personally was like,
I already agree with this and it doesn't require me to make any changes, so I should just try to change everybody else.
Even though there were definitely inward changes that I needed to make, and I should have been self-reflecting and thinking, am I actually being a compassionate and kind and loving and empathetic person? Yeah, there were people who were up there on stage saying you should be these things, but saying you should do that and then actually living it out is a completely different thing. And the way that we were told to act and the way we were told to view people who were different from us was not kind or compassionate or loving or caring. It was really hateful and demonizing toward people who were outside of the church. I know that I and several of the people I was close with held these opinions, even if we weren't really willing to admit it. That was the way that we viewed those people outside of the church. They were outsiders. They were people that we could interact with within the context of trying to get them to come over to our side, rather than interacting with them as fellow human beings who are just as screwed up as we are. We're not better than them. Being in the church and hearing the way that people outside of the church were discussed and talked about, like people who just had to be brought into the fold, and then we could interact with them. I developed this sense of superiority, even if that really wasn't what I would call it at the time. And even if I at the time didn't think I was superior, I really lived like I did and behaved like I did, and always felt like anybody that I interacted with who was outside of the church, I had to limit my interaction with them and had to limit how much I cared about them and empathize with them. And until those people came to my side, I could not regard them as friends or people who were close or people that I could honestly love, even if I believed I was, as phrase goes, particularly in youth group, loving on them. It's really cringy. And that is really what I want to address here, is that I severely lacked empathy. A little bit for people in the church, but greatly for people outside of the church. This, for me, is the biggest problem that I have to address when I look at my religious past, the lack of empathy and what it took for me to finally develop it. My lack of empathy really shines when I look back at my religious history and think of what we called outreaches. I don't know how prevalent this is across every church, but I know that it is something that was addressed in Red and Link's Ear Biscuits podcast when they did their own spiritual deconstruction, and something that they said they had problems with even at the time. And it is something that I myself had an issue with, but couldn't put my finger on it and just dismissed every time I felt uncomfortable with it. But outreaches were essentially entrapments for people. It was an event that usually a youth group would put on to invite a bunch of people who were outside of the church. They would encourage you to bring your friends to these events. They would have things like pizza and water slides and games and all of this. Then at the end, there'd be a surprise. Guess what? This isn't just a fun event where you can hang out with your friends. We're actually trying to get you to join our church. And at the end of these events, they would have what is called an invitational, which is where they invite everybody who is not a Christian to come down to the front and ask to let Jesus into their heart. And they play a song and they stand there for a long time. It's very uncomfortable, both for me at the time, even I was uncomfortable, and also for the people who are there who are being pressured into doing this and feel compelled to come forward and join up with the church because their friends are standing there next to them and they suddenly realize, oh, this is why my friend brought me here. It's not because they wanted to spend time with me and hang out and have fun and have me meet their other friends. It's because they wanted me to join their religion and come forward at this moment, and this is the time that I have to do it. And also, this time is going on for a long time. I feel like this song has been repeating for 7 minutes. I'm sure that there have been studies done or something. I didn't look them up before I started filming this. I might look them up afterward. So I don't know exactly what it is that forces people to come forward at the end of these outreaches, but outreaches are what made me feel most uncomfortable in the church at the time. But I couldn't put my finger on it, and I still participated in them and invited friends to them. I remember in particular at my primary church, There was one outreach event that our youth group had that I really liked. It was when we would go to a juvenile prison. It was about an hour or an hour and a half away from our church, and we would bring pizza to the prisoners and sit down with them and just talk. But then at the end of it, we would have one of those invitationals. So we're sitting there and we're just talking to them, and we would be told beforehand, you just need to sit down, talk to them, be friends with them, because a lot of these people are in situations that you would have been into and you might have made those same choices. You are fortunate that you did not have to make those decisions. And that reads like a really empathetic thing. But then at the end of it, we have this invitational that shows that there has been an ulterior motive the entire time. This was all just a ruse to make you let your guard down so that we can invite you to join our religion. That still did not sit well with me. Driving home from that event, I felt extra uncomfortable, and I still couldn't understand why I didn't feel comfortable with what I'd just done, because I'd sat down at a table with 5 or 6 other people, and I was extremely introverted at the time. I did not like talking to strangers, but I had a conversation with them and it was fun. I wasn't uncomfortable at all. I enjoyed talking to them and hearing their stories and telling them about my life when they had questions for me. I liked that event. And then when they started the invitational, I remember sitting there at the table with them and I just felt really uncomfortable with what was happening. I can say that now that it felt wrong and manipulative, especially manipulative, but at the time, I didn't even know that manipulative was something that would have crossed my mind about how I was feeling about it. I just knew that it didn't feel like what I was doing was right and like I was participating in some sort of ruse. So, learning empathy. I began to learn empathy while I was still in the church. I was probably about 16 or 17 when I can definitively say that I noticed something flip on. I remember I was getting more and more angry and rebellious toward the church itself rather than just toward people who were outside of the church. I started seeing contradiction after contradiction and having problems with the things that were being taught and getting into arguments with some of the leaders in the church. This was particularly evident in the youth group that I was attending at the time. I was not happy with some of the things that were being taught, and that discomfort that I'd had for so long, particularly toward invitationals, was beginning to grow and blossom. Even if I wasn't understanding what it was, I was becoming extremely restless. Eventually, this all came to a head and I began going to a different youth group that was across the street. I don't remember exactly what event led to me doing this, but I just started walking across the street and going to that youth group, which, hey, welcome to Texas. There was a church across the street that had a youth group at the same time as mine, like within walking distance.
Come on!
Anyway, on Wednesday nights, I started going to the youth group across the street, and it was one of the best decisions that I have probably ever made. And I think that this youth group was responsible for shaping me into the better person that I definitely am now. Attending that youth group and hearing the youth pastor speak and talking to him outside of the youth group absolutely changed the trajectory of my life and affected me in an incredibly positive way. I cannot thank that group and those people enough. The youth pastor as well, and I know that he follows me on Instagram, but I don't know if he's gonna watch this. If you are, hey, what's up? Thank you for everything you did for me. He was compassionate, kind, understanding, and intelligent. He had so many intelligent conversations, and he was willing to sit down and talk with me about some of the struggles I was facing and some of the things that were making me uncomfortable. Even if he disagreed with me, I felt heard and felt like he cared enough to sit down and talk to me like I was an adult. This stood in stark contrast to the previous youth group that I had been attending. Absolutely changed my life for the better. And I'm so glad that he was willing to sit down and hear me out, especially when I was so angry early on and as I got a little less angry as time continued onward. Additionally, the other people my age or around my age who attended that group were so much more kind and loving and understanding and empathetic than the people I had been in the previous youth group with. They cared about people who were there and cared about the people outside of the church in a way that I had always subconsciously wanted to, but been incapable of doing. They were not perfect, nobody is, but it was a lot better and a huge step up from where I'd been before. In fact, to compare this to the prison ministry that I mentioned earlier, I remember one night we went to a nursing home and just sat, talked, and played games with some of the residents of that nursing home. There was no invitational. Not that I remember anyway. We just sat and talked to them, spent time with them, heard their stories, shared our stories, played games. It was casual sitting down and loving people, actually loving and empathizing and being compassionate toward them with no ulterior motive or secret goal, just being kind. That was huge for me. That was one of the first moments when I realized why I was so uncomfortable at the other places was because there'd always been this ulterior motive, and it was manipulative and cruel and completely lacking in empathy, and now I was just being kind to people for the sake of being compassionate and trying to make someone else's day better. This youth group totally changed my life and trajectory, and even if I wouldn't attend it today, I am very grateful for everything that it did for me. And I don't look back on that period of my life with anything but fondness. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this one because discussing this has gotten me into some trouble in the past, so I'm going to be brief on this. But in the background of all of this, from the ages of I think about 15 and onward, every summer I would spend 2 weeks to a month in another state, helping out another church or spending time with somebody I had become friends there who was a pastor's daughter. And the pastor was honestly, to this day, one of the worst people who I have ever been associated with to a significant degree. Staying with him in his home and seeing him abuse his family and then get up on the stage and behind the podium and speak a sermon about being loving and compassionate and kind on Sunday was really horrible. That was absolutely one of the things that was key in how I am today. It really affected me to see just how two-faced he was and caused me to wonder how two-faced everyone else was. Because he was very convincing up on that stage, but his abuse would start as soon as we were in the parking lot of that church. And I remember a few times in particular when some really nasty things happened. And bear in mind, this is between the ages of about 15 and 18 or 19 for me. I'm really young, and I also am incredibly immature because I have very few life experiences, but there were some really nasty things that he did. I remember one time he had done something horrible to somebody while I was still at home, and he called me because he wanted to get ahead of the other person's story. And again, I think I was 16, maybe 17 at the time, but he called me because he wanted to get ahead of this person's story because he didn't want me to think badly of him. And I mean, I didn't know what to do. I'm freaking 16 and I'm a kid who has no experience. What am I supposed to do when this abusive guy who I've seen abuse people calls me and says,
"Just so you know, here's what actually happened," before the other person comes and tells you what happened. This is what really happened.
And I remember I just said, yeah, sure, I believe you. Yeah, that sounds true. And I just went with it. I didn't believe him. I didn't know what happened. I mean, that kind of manipulation is horrendous. And another time he said some really nasty things to his wife right before he and I drove around. I don't remember where we were going. We were going downtown, just the two of us. And on the drive there, he was trying to convince me that how he'd behaved was okay. And I was just sitting there in the seat, probably 17 or 18 at the time. I'm just sitting there in his passenger seat, not knowing what to do. Like, I just heard how he treated her. I knew it wasn't okay. But he's sitting here trying to convince me that it was fine and that he was in the right. And almost like he's trying to talk himself into it while also trying to convince me. And I remember these moments distinctly. There were others, but these two in particular were just so cruel and manipulative. And if I had been a worse person at the time, I probably could have very easily really believed him and fallen into his ways. And I don't want to know what that would have looked like, but that's the kind of person that I was dealing with. And he was completely key in getting me to where I am today in terms of how I view the church. And I want to point out here, I heard a couple of years ago that he's better. I don't know if that's true, and I do not care. There is no excuse or anything for what he did, and he did some other terrible things later on. Again, I don't want to get into it, and I don't want to dive too deeply into this because talking about it has gotten me into some trouble. Even though I'm pretty sure I could handle that trouble now, I don't really want to risk that. That was a very important moment for me. I don't want my sudden departure from the church to sound like, you had such a great experience, why did you suddenly stop going? I remember distinctly the last time that I really was consistent about going to church was the last interaction that I had with him. There's one last thing I want to touch on before we move on regarding how I got to where I am today. And that is going to be my move to Kansas City. When I was 19, I lived in an apartment in Arlington, Texas, about an hour away from my family. And then my family moved to Kansas City which is 8 hours away from my apartment, so it was a lot less feasible that I could see them. A few months after they moved, I also moved up there to be with them. I think 3 to 6 months before I moved up there. I had no friends in Kansas City. I had nobody I could lean on apart from my family. But it didn't take long for me to start meeting people. And it is those people I met that contributed to me growing and becoming who I am today. One of the primary accelerators is actually the first person that I met in Kansas City. And she picked me out. Her first message to me was just the word you. And I said, me? And then she said, yeah, you should come over for dinner tonight. And I did, because I didn't know anybody and she was really cute. So I went over for dinner. She had a kid. She was also 5 or 6 years older than me. That relationship, if you can call it that, was pretty defining for me. And she also lived right around the corner from my job rather than 40 minutes away from my job, which is where I was living at the time. So being able to spend the night with her meant that I didn't have to wake up incredibly early to go to the job I hated. So I was a little homosexual as well. And that was one of the reasons to stick with the relationship, to be perfectly honest with you. I finally knew somebody in this strange city when things weren't scary and rough. They were a lot of fun. We would play games and watch movies and cook dinner and all of these other relationship-y things that I had always thought I was never going to get to experience until I got married. Like I said, this was really defining for me and a huge shift in my own personality, particularly because my previous relationship had been with the daughter of that pastor that I mentioned earlier. This is a complete shift in the other direction. And that kind of became a pattern for me between the ages of about 19 and 25. I was a bit of a serial dater, and I was actively seeking to date people who were not like myself or like anybody I had ever really interacted with and spent time with. And that, I think, even though there was a lot of negativity that came out of that and some bad things, I believe that in the end, this was a positive thing for me and for my growth, because I learned so much through it and developed so much as a person as a result of all of these relationships. So where am I now? And this is what all of this has been culminating toward, is where do I see myself at this stage in my life? I would say that the most significant period of growth that I had was between the ages of about 19 to 25. And I am still growing, and I hope I always grow and learn and am willing to change. I am absolutely a lot less angry than I was back then. In fact, I really don't like conflict at all, and I go out of my way to avoid it. I don't stir things up like I used to, be it political or religious or anything. I don't have space mentally for that sort of thing anymore. And that is totally a good thing. And I am so glad that I do not actively seek out disruption and conflict like I did when I was younger. I also want to say that I have not completely abandoned spirituality. This is a religious postmortem because I have absolutely abandoned that religion and the beliefs that I held when I was younger. But I would still consider myself a spiritual person. I am just empathetic and kind and loving, and I seek to be non-confrontational, and I definitely do not hold the vast majority of the things I believed back then. And part of me really isn't sure what I believe at this point, but I'm not sitting here saying that I completely discount all forms of spirituality. There is so much more positivity in my life now that I am no longer associated with that group and with those people. Now, I'm still close with a couple of friends from that period of my life, but the closeness I have with them is so incredibly different from the closeness I had with them then, and from the closeness that I have with the friends in my life now. I am far, far, far from being perfect, but I wholeheartedly believe that I'm a better person now by miles and miles than I was back then. I've definitely shed all of the religious dogma that I grew up with. That has allowed me as well to be a kinder and more accepting and loving person. And that is really what my goal has been for so long, is just to be empathetic and loving and kind. And I feel like I am either at that stage or am really close to just being the kind of peaceful person that I want to be. Looking back at old posts that I made and seeing the amount of hate and anger that I had toward people who were different from myself is surreal to me now. My religious past was riddled with both negative and positive aspects, and I hope that I did justice to both of those in this post. I don't want to sit here and pretend that everything about my past was horrible and awful. There were some good parts that I can take out and that can still apply to my life today. There was just a lot of negativity that I needed to address as well. If you are somebody who was part of that past, again, regardless of which part you were, you did help to shape who I am today. And so even if you're somebody that I would not thank personally, you can pat yourself on the back for the role that you played in this, because it's pretty nice. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this post. I hope that you got something out of it. I post personal things every Friday. Sometimes it's just me ranking my favorite video games, and sometimes it's me spilling out my guts about my religious history. On Wednesdays, I release reviews for stories, mostly books, but sometimes I'll review a movie or a game here and there. And then on Mondays, I release advice. In fact, right now, I'm in the middle of a homebrew campaign creation series. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing to my channel or following me on social media. I am at TLBainter on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, with Instagram being where I am most active. If you made it to the end and you're hearing this, then I am really grateful to you for sticking around for the whole thing. I appreciate you very much, and I will see you next time. Until then, bye.